is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. There might not be a more loaded term in beer and chocolate than craft. What does it mean? Who gets to use it? And who gets to decide who does or doesn't fall under its umbrella? Is craft about size and ownership? Is it about processes and ingredients? Or, as Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart famously said about pornography in a 1964 case on obscenity in art, I know it when I see it. There are no perfect answers to these questions, and the parameters and stakes are different for both beer and chocolate, but it's a fascinating topic for discussion. Today I'm sitting down with Clay Gordon, one of the most respected names in the world of craft chocolate, to discuss the meaning of craft, how the terms usage and meaning differ in the beer and chocolate worlds, how tasting and judging have influenced beer and chocolate differently, and toward the end, how we both approach chocolate pairings with beer and other beverages. Clay has been involved in craft chocolate since before that term even existed. After years of research, he launched his first website, Chocophile, in 2001 to blog about the nascent beer-to-bar movement. His book, Discovered Chocolate, came out several years later, and in 2008 he launched The Chocolate Life, his current hub for all things chocolate and cacao. It's changed hosts and formats over the years, but it remains a source of knowledge and fun for chocolate lovers and professionals alike. Through his webcast, Pod Save Chocolate, he covers various topics in the chocolate world and interviews a diverse array of guests. I'll link to The Chocolate Life and his YouTube channel in the show notes. Before we jump into our conversation, I want to give just a little bit of background on some of the inside baseball conversation we have around craft beer. While anyone can decide for themselves how to define craft beer, the Brewers Association, the largest craft beer industry trade group, has long held to specific guidelines to decide who will and will not be recognized as craft. Currently, this includes any brewery that brews less than 6 million barrels of beer annually, and in which no other beverage alcohol company owns more than a 24% share of ownership. These definitions have changed radically over the years and to much criticism. There used to be guidelines that specified what styles of beer could exclude a brewery from being craft, the production size limits have changed, and the ownership rules have changed. Often, these requirements have shifted to accommodate specific breweries the BA wanted to keep in the fold. One of the main examples is Boston Beer Company, better known as Sam Adams. Boston Beer was one of the foundational craft breweries of the 1980s and still brews excellent beer. Just this winter, I wrote an article about their program to mentor and support small breweries to give back to the industry and promote further innovation and diversity. As Sam Adams has grown over the years and its portfolio has shifted, the BA has repeatedly shifted its craft definition to accommodate Boston Beer. I think Boston Beer is a great brewery, but one does learn to take the BA's proclamations with a grain of salt when this kind of thing happens. While the desire to define craft as a way to promote independent breweries is a well-intentioned one, it's become clear over time that no one concrete definition will suffice long-term. Beer changes, culture changes, and lines in the sand are likely to get washed out with the tide. Clay and I discussed this and whether or not this is the same on the craft chocolate side of things. Listen in as we hear from Clay Gordon. Clay, you have been working in the craft chocolate world for decades now, going back into the 90s, I believe. And the first thing I want to talk with you about is that word I just used, craft chocolate. This is a very loaded term, both in craft beer, craft chocolate. It's been argued over. It's been defended in court, at least on the beer side. And I'm curious to hear from you how you've seen some changes in that word on the chocolate side over time. Before we start getting into details, how have you seen that change in the way we've used the word craft to refer to craft chocolate over time?
Well, there's this enormous confusion around identity in the world of quote unquote craft chocolate. I mean, the first term that we used was coined, the first phrase we used was coined by Scharfenberger in the late 1990s, and it was bean to bar chocolate. And bean to bar talks about a process, right? It's just I start with beans and I make bars, right? And it doesn't have anything else loaded onto it. So, and I think that there is value in taking a term and not trying to overlay all this weight on top of it, right? But the challenge with bean to bar is that, as Scharfenberger started with, it meant that what they were doing was different from big chocolate, right? So they had all these attributes that we think of in terms of small scale, hands-on, artisanal production. And very, very quickly, it started, we had these wars, like the difference between Mac and PC, right? Which is, okay, what do we mean? If I'm going to be bean to bar, does it mean I need to own all of the equipment in my own factory? Or could I have some of the processes be done on the farm or by an intermediary, as long as I, the manufacturer, like personally oversaw everything? Right? And there are people who are come out on this vocally, right? In extremes, and I'm more of a moderate on this, right? My thought on when it comes to bean to bar is that it's about supervision, right? If I'm going to have somebody grind the liquor for me in a producing country, then I want to be there to see it ground, right? Because that assumes that there's a roasting step before that, and I want to oversee the roasting step. Mm-hmm. And so as long as there is that, I don't have a problem at all with, how, the way bean to bar is used. I'm not an absolutist in that respect. Craft has this problem, which I think is a lot like craft beer, is that nobody really knows what the defining attributes, what makes a craft beer, what makes a craft chocolate. And then we had this whole notion of artisan. I mean, I don't know if artisan beer was ever a thing, and we went straight to craft beer, right? But we've got half the world, trying to differentiate between what craft chocolate is and what artisan chocolate is. And so there's a lot of confusion around that. And my contention as, an observer of the industry for as long as I have, is that if we as the maker community are really confused about it, it's no wonder that consumers are confused about it. And so I'm less worried about what the precise definition is than I am with making sure that we all agree that when we use the term, this is what we mean, and that we grab a definition that cannot be co-opted by big chocolate.
Well, I think that's the problem, is all agreeing on it.
Yeah. I mean, but again, here's where I would go and say, let's focus on a simpler definition. So some people want to throw a definition of craft is you can only be a craft chocolate maker until you reach a certain size. Or you can only be a craft chocolate maker if you don't go above a certain batch size. So you're a craft chocolate maker if you're a micro batch chocolate maker, right? But, how small and how big is a micro batch? And what's the next step up? Is it small batch? Is it mini batch? I mean, there's this whole attempt. If the moment you say size is a determinative of what a craft chocolate maker is, you've just said, we've overlaid something on top of it and we make it harder to come to a decision. Would it be possible to be an unethical craft chocolate maker? The answer is yes, right? So are we going to add the ethics of sourcing without even having a definition for what ethics means, right? Are we going to adopt that into our definition for craft? And I think that's a mistake, right? And, without, staking out my own personal definition for the difference between a craft chocolate maker and an industrial chocolate maker, because I think that's the dichotomy that we want to hold up, as is craft beer. You got somebody who's got a brew pub, like right around the corner from me here in Prescott. There's this lovely brew pub. You might have a beer that's there for a week and they sell out and they've got something new, and it's all about the new thing. And you can see all the work and you can talk to the brewer. There are aspects of that which I think become part of the craft movement, which make it very, very different from industrial. But I think it's around these notions of intent rather than size or ethics or anything else. that if we come to an agreement on, it's easy. I think it would be easier to come to an agreement on.
Sure. Well, let me ask you this before we break apart a few of the points that you brought up. You're working in chocolate every day. What is your sense of how people are kind of coalescing around a term? Does it feel like craft chocolate is kind of the term that is going to stick? We moved away a little bit from bean to bar as the defining term. How are you seeing that fluctuate in the general chocolate world?
So right now, I think that the fundamental debate is around the use of the word fine
Hmm.
more than anything else. We have the Fine Cocoa and Chocolate Institute. We have the Fine Chocolate Industry Association. We have Cacao Fino y de Aroma. So right now, I think it's around fine, whatever fine means, and bean to bar. And one of the challenges I think I've found with most definitions of fine is that you might say, well, no Forastero cocoa beans that are done, in a West African country ever reach being fine, which is completely untrue. Because if we go to someplace like the Cacao of Excellence, we know that there are Ghanaian cocoa beans and Ivorian cocoa
Mm-hmm.
beans that have won, very, very high marks on those awards. And so, fine is a value judgment, which I think is wrong because
Mm-hmm.
among other things, it says, well, we can just ignore the work of 80% of the cocoa farmers in the world, which I think is a mistake from the very beginning. It's like, why
Yeah.
would we ever want to do that? Because those are the farmers that need the most help. So I would gravitate, we're here talking about beer and chocolate, but I would gravitate towards the use of the word specialty as specialty coffee, right? A specialty chocolate is any chocolate which is made from a specialty cocoa bean. And then let's figure out what specialty cocoa means. And it becomes this almost a tautology, which makes it really, really easy. And, the coffee industry has spent the last 25 years, right? Helping people understand what specialty coffee is. I think that's probably the direction I would go when it comes
Specialty.
to
How is specialty? How would you distinguish specialty from fine? Is it? I mean, that isn't just changing words.
no, because I can have a specialty cocoa bean grown anywhere in the world, right? I'm not making so again, so I can have a specialty coffee bean, and I'm not talking about genetics. I'm not talking about where the bean was grown. It's just a specialty coffee bean is any bean which gets an 80 plus score by Q graders. Right. And I think that is the direction we need to move towards when it comes to chocolate. Right. We need to have specialty chocolate first. We need to promote that because that's going to generate the income, right? To promote all of the efforts we want to do on farms. Right. And I think that's one of the reasons why coming to agreement is really important on what the terms means, is because, chocolate is what, $180 billion a year industry when you think about it,
Mm-hmm.
in its total. And then the quote unquote bean to bar craft chocolate movement is maybe 1.5% of that, right? Which is really, really tiny.
Yeah.
And if we're going to grow the market, we need to find a simpler way to communicate to the consumers who haven't already bought into the notion of what craft chocolate is or bean to bar chocolate is or specialty chocolate
And
is.
I think that's it. Is that need to be able to communicate that. So much of this, I think, comes down to the economy of language of needing something that can just instantly identify a product as a particular group. There is good beer being brewed by non-craft breweries. There's good beer from very, very large corporate breweries. We want some way to say this beer right here it's in this group. It's culturally kind of part of this type of brewery so that you know what it is when you see it on the shelf. And I think that need to do that is what drives so much of this, of needing a term that we can use. And it's hard to think of any one word that is going to be able to actually box that out and define it.
Right. I don't disagree with you, but excuse me, focusing on a specific word. So rather than focusing on a specific word, right? What I think we're actually talking around is consensus communications. So if we as an industry, when we say this is what we mean when we say bean to bar, it's just a process. I bring in cocoa beans, I end up making bars, right? If when we say craft chocolate and artisan chocolate, we mean the same thing, and this is what we mean, right? So there's a sense in artisan which is very, very much about handmade, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that does influence a lot of makers' intent. There is this group of people who say the more time I spend making my chocolate, the higher quality is. If I spend 2 hours sorting my cocoa beans, my chocolate will be better than if I spend an hour sorting my cocoa beans. And so there is this equation of time with quality, which I don't think makes a whole lot of sense. And I think that we find somewhere in that idea that artisan as opposed to craft, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think. But we don't necessarily need to come into 100% agreement. What we need to do is listen, if you want to use artisan, go ahead, use artisan. But as a group, this is what we mean. If you want to use craft, this is what we mean, right? If you want to use handcrafted, this is what we mean. If you want to use specialty, this is what we mean, right? And that you might talk with one person, right, using a different set of terms. I mean, one of the things that I learned as an educator, I have a 20-year background in high technology, is that when I went and did demonstrations in front of people and talked in front of people, I need to have 3 or 4 different ways of describing the same concept, right? Because my audience might be at a different level, and I might have people at different levels within the same audience. And so I'll get the question, and I think I'm being clear, and somebody says, I don't understand. So you have to go, okay, here's another way of thinking
Mm-hmm.
about this and doing it. And so I think we this rather than focusing on there is only one way we're going to talk about this, right? And this is the way, and we're all going to agree to it. I mean, I would say that perfection, right, is the enemy of progress, right? What we can say is, listen, this whole exercise is going to be a 5-year goal. We're going to get to this in 5 years, but we're going to agree to this now, but we're going to agree to the goal. And getting people to agree to the goal, I think, is an okay thing. And I think it's a great place to start the consensus to move things forward. Because I
Yeah.
think that the lack of consensus communications is confusing the 95% of the market that looks and goes, $12 for a chocolate bar? No way. I mean, it's just way too much. But these same people would spend an insane amount of money for a leather belt, or what I would consider to be an insane amount. Or a bicycle. I mean, there are people who've got $5,000 bicycles and 20 sets of spandex riding gear, right, for different weather conditions and clip-on shoes and all that kind of stuff. And I'm aware of it, but I'm like, nah, I just want a bike to get me around.
Right.
It's all about what's important to us. And I think that's the point we all need to remember. We need to have different ways of talking to people around the values that we as a group espouse to, right? So that when we can identify what the person we're talking to is interested in, then we can, now we have the point of entry. We now have the point where I can go, what is it? I mean, we got some people who would, never pay more than $10 for a bottle of wine. We got people who think, spending $100, $300, $500 because they've trained themselves to be able to appreciate the difference. And the same thing is true of beer. There's some people who are only going to be with lagers and pilsners, and they're never going to get to even a porter or even an amber. I mean, I'm a big fan of Belgian red ales.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about that in the past. In West Vleteren and Six Deuce and these kinds of things. There is this interest in experiencing,
Mm-hmm.
right, which comes with other kinds of things like coffee and beer, right, and wine, which often there's not a whole lot of curiosity when it comes to chocolate, which is really quite interesting to me. Right?
Well,
Why
one
not?
interesting point of comparison here, we're talking pretty much the same way as we're discussing this around beer and chocolate, but the stakes aren't necessarily the same, because on the chocolate side, we also have the ethical concern of the cacao supply chain, which is invisible to most consumers. They don't know anything about the fact that there are cacao farmers who are living in poverty and all these associated issues. So on the beer side, it's one thing to argue about what term do we use. On the chocolate side, it feels like there's a little bit more stakes involved in being able to explain what this chocolate is, why it does cost more. And that's where, for me, it sometimes feels like, man, having a term, having something we can use to easily convey this would be so helpful. How do you see that issue of just language interacting with the fact that there are some real significant human stakes involved in how we describe the type of chocolate we're talking about?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This fifth issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bono Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
Well, there are 2 points that I want to make, and so please make sure I make 2 points.
Okay.
One of which is around where hops are grown, right? And the other one is we need to remember that we need to recognize that chocolate as we know it today is a product of the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. That there was no 1,000-year history of appreciation and connoisseurship of chocolate that predated the Industrial Revolution. We have those histories of appreciation and connoisseurship, right? In tea, we have those histories of connoisseurship and appreciation in wine, in beer, in spirits, in cheese, right? In many things. None of that existed prior to the Industrial Revolution. Everything we think we know about chocolate comes out of the industrialization of the process. Right? And what is the hallmark of industrial products? Absolute repeatability and consistency. So we've been brought up to expect that. Right? And it's not until like the early 1980s, right? Maybe a little earlier, but the 1980s when Bonat introduced the first single origin bars in the modern day era, right? That we started hearkening back to the pre-industrial or the early days of the Industrial Revolution when it comes to chocolate manufacture. And this whole idea of chocolate appreciation and connoisseurship is 40 years old. That's it, right? Coffee goes back much further, right? So pre-revolutionary, even during the Revolutionary War here in the United States, chocolate was what you drank when you didn't drink tea because it was patriotic to drink chocolate as opposed to drink tea. So we have no understanding the history, right? And I think that's part of the challenge here, right? And to some extent, bean to bar chocolate, or especially 2-ingredient chocolate, is actually not a forward-thinking movement. It's a retro movement. So we're going back to pre-1847 styles of chocolate making, right before the Fry family started adding cocoa butter. Right? So, there's this lack of understanding, which is just, which represents an opportunity as much as it is really, really frustrating. And I think another part of this is, number one, cacao has always been part of an sort of economic imperialism, right, regime. So we looked at the conquering Spanish and British and Dutch and Portuguese, right, and the desire for sugar production and to go find spices and cacao, right, and so it had this regime and associated illegal labor practices going back from the very beginning, 400 years. All that would be different if cacao trees grew in the Loire Valley. So if 100% of the world's hop supply grew in equatorial Africa, we'd be having this conversation today about hops.
Right.
Right.
Point, yeah.
And and the same thing is true. Barley, if all of the barley that was used to make beer, right, grew in Tierra del Fuego for one reason or another, we'd be having this conversation. And the same thing is true of grapes. If all of the grapes used to make wine, right, were in foreign countries and countries where we use language like developing and third world, right, and south as opposed to north. I mean, even the language that we use to describe this thing says, these people are literally beneath us, right? The world of beer would be different. We have some of that challenge in coffee, right, as well. There is some of that imperialism in coffee. And so when we think about the ethical concerns, number one, what do we mean by ethics, right? And how are ethics different from morals? Because they're not the same thing, right? And if I use the word sustainable, what do I mean? And if you use the word sustainable, what do you mean? So I think this is why consensus communications become really, really important. But if you don't understand the history, right, you're also doomed to repeat it. My big worry is that 3 years from now, is that if we don't make some fundamental changes, that the current upheaval has revealed sort of like, there are some vulnerabilities in the system, and we need to figure out a way to tackle those vulnerabilities now, right? Because 3 years from now, it's all just going to be status quo ante, and we will not have learned a thing, and we will not have solved any problems.
Let's talk about this
that's what keeps me up at night, talking about the cacao supply chain.
Let's talk about this a little bit in terms of scale, because inevitably these discussions about terms like craft and all the associated words get stretched and start to fracture once you get at larger and larger scales. So maybe you come up on the beer side with a definition that you like for what craft beer is, and then suddenly a brewery gets bigger and bigger, and Sam Adams starts brewing however many millions of barrels of beer, and suddenly it means like, well, okay, does that definition still work anymore once we get at that large scale? On the chocolate side, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when we're looking at broadly what we're calling craft chocolate, we don't have any makers that are quite on that kind of scale as we're seeing on the beer side yet. But we do have some that are definitely many, many, many times the size of a lot of the small batch makers that we're looking at. How do you see scale kind of starting to strain the use of some of these terms in chocolate?
I don't think we should use scale as an indicator. I think that's part of the problem, right? We can see the challenge that the beer world has seen, and to some extent, coffee as well. At what point are you no longer a craft roaster? We could say if you want to be a craft roaster, you have to be a batch roaster, but there are a batch roasting facility that will do 4 tons an hour. I mean, is that craft, right? So I think that we need to focus the word craft, if that's what we want to use, around intent, right? And to be able to say, okay, an industrial maker, right, basically starts out with the end goal in mind, right? If I'm an industrial beer maker, right, I'm an industrial brewer, I know what the end product has got to be. And it doesn't matter what my inputs are, the output has got to be exactly the same, right? And that's my intention. Now, it could be that I'm a big chocolate maker, Felkland in Switzerland, comes to mind, whereas a lot of their chocolate is industrial. And then they've got this line of chocolates, right, which is the Grand Cru line, which feels more crafty, right? And it's done using entirely different machinery in terms of the conching stage, even though they're using the same roasting. So it's possible to be both. I mean, does Sam Adams, they're doing, when they do they do a very limited production beer compared with the rest of it, right? And so they could be crafty in a seasonal release, and the rest of their stuff is industrial. I mean, I would be happy with that idea. So I think with a craft chocolate maker, what you're doing is the beans I have represent an opportunity for creative expression. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best. I have my viewpoint as a chocolate maker, and I'm going to try to express the flavor of these beans through my viewpoint. Whatever I end up with is what I end up with. My goal is not to take the beans and make them taste exactly the same every single time. And I think that's intent, right? And that's one of the ways that you can, and I know you didn't want to, have me stake a position, but I think that intent, right, is the right place to draw the line in the sand and say, if you cross this line, right, you're an industrial maker. If you stay on this side of the line, you're a craft maker, recognizing that
intent
if
is
I'm doing
inherently fuzzy.
well,
Like,
but
it's
if I'm
impossible to identify.
Right, but let's, with naming names. All right, I'm going to name names because
Go
I
for
think
it.
is if I look at Dandelion, right, they have this new chocolate factory, which to some extent I think was supposed to be dedicated to couverture. Right. If I'm buying a couverture as a chocolate maker, I want to make sure that it's the same every single time, because if the pH changes and I'm baking with it, I don't want to change the leavening in the recipe. If the viscosity changes, I don't want to change the settings on my machines, from batch to batch to batch. So when I get into, I'm making chocolate and other people's technical demands are driving what it is that I'm doing, right? Then that's an industrial product, and there's nothing wrong with it, right? We're doing it. But Dandelion has got this, smaller batch production that they're working with, which is definitely on the crafty side. You can be both, right? And I would contend that a lot of bigger brewers are both, right? In many, many ways. And we need to call out big chocolate for their unethical sourcing practices.
Right.
Right. And I'm going to use ethical in the term that says basically is reminiscent of the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. So do no harm to people, do no harm to the environment. Right. And it's very, very simple. People go, yeah, I get it. Right. And we need to get to that level of simplicity at some levels. But I think that just to really nail this point home, I think that craft is not about size. Right. Craft is about intent. Right? And I would say that if you are asked as a chocolate maker to say, here's a ton of beans, and I need you to create a ton of chocolate that tastes exactly the same from the ton of beans, you should master the techniques, right? The technical aspects of your craft, so that if asked, you could produce a large amount of chocolate that is in fact identical, right? But that doesn't necessarily define you. I think that's an important aspect of this as well, right? That we not get stuck up on, am I good at what I'm doing? Because I could be a craft brewer and be a bad brewer.
Well, we both
be,
know that being small does not guarantee quality either on either side, on beer or chocolate. Without coming down here on a position, just as a counterpoint with this, I think when you're a very small chocolate maker, and I think this is true for beer too, but it's different, I think, on the small scales we're talking about for some small chocolate makers. It gets harder and harder to say that it's not about scale when you look at what their costs are and what some of the cost advantages larger makers have. And I know I've heard from some very small makers that they don't feel like they're fighting the same fight. And it starts to feel like there's a division between big and small.
I'm not saying that there isn't a difference. I'm not saying that that's how we define ourselves, right? So absolutely. I mean, one of the ways that you can think about the difference between a craft or artisan maker and industrial maker is that the industrial maker has done everything that they can to take labor costs to as close to zero as they possibly can. Everything is automated. Right? So they become very, very susceptible to ingredients cost, right? And that a small maker, right, to some extent doesn't care about labor costs. I mean, they should, right? They should be very, very well aware, because they have no control over ingredients cost either. The only thing they have control over is the cost of labor. And so there is this ethos in small maker chocolate, as I mentioned earlier, that more labor is automatically better, right? Which is not necessarily the case. But there is a sense in which, if I'm trying to make a living having like 5, 10-pound grinders, just the amount of labor involved in doing that, right? In manipulating that, just makes it very, very difficult to compete. I mean, I am a huge fan of John Nancy. I think John Nancy is one of the most important people when we talk about the modern craft chocolate movement. I would point to John as one of the most influential people, and chocolate alchemy, right? And I would think that I would put Martin Christie up there as well, 70%.com, which he started publishing 70%.com the same month that I started publishing chocophile.com. So back in May of 2001, right? And so what we have is 3 different communities that are focusing on different aspects of the whole process, right? But John, far and away. And what he said is, normally if you wanted to start a chocolate factory, you had to spend millions of dollars. But if you want to make chocolate, here's a way to make a chocolate, and you don't even have to spend $1,000 on it. Right? And a whole lot of people went out and did that, but really didn't understand what it took to make a sustainable chocolate business. And so their expectations going in, I think, are set in the wrong place. I mean, most small chocolate makers are chronically underfunded because they go in there thinking, I don't need, I can create a business and invest $10,000 in equipment in a rented kitchen, right? And I can compete with Scharfenberger, right? Or I can compete with a bunch of, and no, I mean, part of this also is, in my practice, I will talk to people, listen, you need to be very careful about choosing your mentors and choosing your models. I mean, you need to recognize that, in 2006, 2007, when the Mass Brothers received a $7 million cash infusion in investment. They'd been in business for a couple of years already. They were in Williamsburg, in the right place, at the right time, with the right product, with the right look. I mean, they defined hipster food. I mean, they were the poster boys for it. Right? And if we're now 15 years later, the market has changed. Right? You need to be doing something different. But if you came into the market right now saying, I want to make chocolate like the Mass Brothers did, right? You're setting yourself up for failure. And this is where not knowing the history. And, if I'm in the beer world and I'm serious about selling beer, I drink everything. And I drink every style, right? If I'm in the wine world, I was in the spirits world for half a decade. And, I spent more time in bars drinking more alcohol than I care to talk about. But, there's a sense in which, I'm in my old world making my own chocolate, right? And I make chocolate for me. And I hope that other people will like the chocolate that I make. And that's a hobby business, right? But is it a real business? And, this is something that, I talk about quite a bit. And it's a challenge for many people. They're just, I get a grinder, I make chocolate. This is like the best chocolate I've ever tasted. I want to share it with everybody. So they fall in love with what they're doing. And that passion is what drives them. And I think that the community around learning to become a home brewer is very different, at least from my experience of it in New York.
Yes and no. I think we've all had that beer from a home brewer who is very proud that they've made beer, and rightly so.
Mm-hmm.
And they're hoping you're going to tell them that it's the best beer you've ever had. And you're trying to figure out how to be polite, so, I mean, I think that same dynamic can exist as well. Let's shift this conversation though a little bit. I think we could continue to talk about craft, but obviously we're not going to solve that problem. I just find it interesting to talk about how those terms get used. One thing I think is interesting, and I think contrasts a little bit between beer and chocolate, is the role that judging and sort of tasting in a structured way has evolved differently in beer and chocolate. On the beer side, the importance of home brewing and having home brewing competitions, and so having a judging rubric by which those competitions could be judged, had a big influence in the way that craft beer developed and the way that styles were defined. And I think that has happened a little bit differently on the chocolate side. Can you talk a little bit about how chocolate judging is developed and how you've seen that influence craft chocolate?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing.
So organized judging of chocolate, like organized judging of beer, right, in that same, or wine or spirits, doesn't exist, right? Or coffee. We have no equivalent of Q grader, and this is fundamentally where chocolate is different from many other things, right? Because we don't have, we're not worried about quality of grapes. We're worried about the wine that is made from grapes, right? We're really not worried about the quality of hops or the quality of grain. And we don't really think about the quality. We don't have malt judges, right, as ingredients, right? So, and, it takes, the process of making chocolate is very, very different from the process of making any of these other things. And so what are we judging, right, is very different. And again, as it turns out, this whole thing about judging the quality of chocolate is at most 40 years old in an organized sense, right? We didn't do it before because prior to the Industrial Revolution, chocolate didn't exist as we know it today. And so we need to be, aware that what we're doing now in chocolate is we're inventing it from scratch. Right? And unfortunately, most of the people who started this just said, let's go look at the W set. We're going to go and evaluate chocolate exactly the same way. But we're going to use the same framework as wine. Right? And it turns out, I don't think it works because people drink wine and people eat chocolate for different reasons. And a lot of people are eating chocolate candy and confections. They're not necessarily, eating chocolate. And when I judge a wine, I'm not judging a wine spritzer. Right? And that's what I'm doing most of the time when I'm judging chocolate. I'm not, I could judge a shandy, especially if it's prepackaged in a can, right? But for the most part, I'm not judging beer cocktails. I could judge beer cocktails. And when it comes to chocolate, that's what we're doing all the time. And, the attempts to go and create judging rubrics around chocolate, right, focus on what I think of as describing what we're tasting, right? So put something in your mouth. What does it taste like? What is the texture? Right? What does it smell like? All these things. And that requires experience. If I'm going to become a master of wine is nothing but training your taste memory. Right? And if I'm going to be a judge in beer, I probably want to drink hundreds of different examples, if not thousands of different examples of different kinds of beers, especially if I'm going to go, I'm going to be able to recognize one hop in a beer or 3 hops in a beer, right? To say, this is a mixture of Cascade and these are 3 other kinds of hops. I mean, that requires an enormous amount of training, right? And that's where I think most people have started off when they're judging chocolate. Describe what it is that you're putting in your mouth, right? What do mushrooms taste like in chocolate, right? That's really, really hard, and now we have, cherries and, it's like, is it dried cherries or is it fresh cherries? And, what kind of cherry is it? And how does the fat component of this, right, change our perception of those things? And so I don't necessarily know that that's the right place to start judging, right? What I really want to do, this has been the way my whole approach to teaching tasting, right, has gone, is I want to help you understand what it is about the things you like that you like, right? And then to use that as a point of entry, so the next time you taste something, you can go, this is why I like it, or this is why I don't. right?
We do have
And to
some
say,
chocolate awards. I mean, we do have some, organizations that are handing out awards. Do you think that those are having any kind of influence on what makers are making, how people are appreciating this? Are people paying attention to bars that won? Does it matter?
so the answer is it matters, but it matters within the closed community that is already educated themselves about chocolate and why they should care. And I would also suggest, so the International Chocolate Awards hugely influential. The Academy of Chocolate Awards hugely influential. We have the new AVPA, so the Agence Valorisation de Produits Agriculture, right in France, where they're focusing on chocolates which are manufactured in producing countries, right? Um, to some extent, maybe the Northwest Chocolate Festival, the Chocolate Alliance Awards, the Good Food Awards, the Great Taste Awards. The Good Food and Great Taste Awards are much broader in scope, so they're trying to reach a much larger audience. Whereas the International Chocolate Awards and the Academy of Chocolate Awards and the Chocolate Alliance Awards, I think are very, very much focused within the community of people who already, right, have bought into this notion. But unfortunately, what I see happening, number one, is there's not a whole lot of transparency in reporting the judging process, right? So, for example, what percentage of people who enter the awards win an award, right? That would be interesting to know. And it's very, very difficult to understand, an enormous amount of work to say, oh, we handed out 200 awards this year. How many of those awards were given to chocolate bars that were made from beans from this country? Because that's interesting to know,
Mm-hmm.
right? We want to find out, which producing countries are being influential, where people are going for their beans. And that's not a part of wine because it's a French wine, it's an Italian wine, it's a Chilean wine. That's built into
Right.
what's going on. So, and people are saying, here is the varietal, and it's like all of that stuff is part. And when a wine and an award, but when you go and try to do the same thing for chocolate, it's really, really hard. And
Yeah.
I've tried to reach out to some of the awards producers, and they are less than willing to be forthcoming and providing, make just even, the makers fill out the form, just put the data in a spreadsheet or something like that. So somebody wants to go and run some reports on it, they don't have to spend tens of hours, if not hundreds of hours, hand editing the data so it's all in the same format. So I don't get that at all. I don't understand why they're so hesitant to share the data, because I think the more of that data we have, the better job we can communicate about what we're doing as a community. So that's a little frustrating to me. And the other part that's frustrating is that to some extent, there's the Robert Parker effect in awards. This is what the judges give awards to, so I'm going to enter that stuff. And to some extent, it stifles innovation in some respects. It's one of the reasons why I was really, really happy when Dustin Cornett, who's the founder of the Craft Chocolate Challenge, said to me, after the 2023 round, let's do an innovation category. Let's go and just recognize stuff that may not have been, risen to the level of winning an award in one of the categories, but we, the judges, thought it was cool. And what we want to do is we want to recognize that, here's somebody who took a risk, and we want to recognize those risks. And that's, if it's chocolate, and if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun,
Right.
and
It should
we're
be
doing
fun.
it wrong.
Yeah.
And so it's like taking it all too seriously is like, well, it's like,
One thing I've noticed with a lot of the chocolate awards, and I'm not going to say this sweepingly that this is all of them, but a few of the bigger ones, is that they tend to do more kind of recognizing bars in tiers rather than saying this is a winner. Like in beer, in a category, in any competition, you have a gold, silver, and bronze. Whereas in chocolate, you might have multiple bars that are given gold recognition and multiple bars, this many that get silver. And it's more just this bar is at this level rather than being a competition in the way that we see on the beer side, where it's like, here's your winner. And I don't know if I'm not saying one is better or worse than the other. It just seems like a difference in how that's done.
so I will say the whole notion of prize inflation, right, is a topic that has been talked about within the awards community in chocolate for a long time, right? And it's one that I've been aware of for since the third year of some of these awards, right? And so and part of this is that these things are designed to be money making business. They're designed to be businesses, right? And they grow their business by having more entries. And so the more categories that they have to judge in, right? So that's I can get more entries in that category, and I will have more revenue from having more entries. And then saying everything that gets above a 90 is a gold, everything that's between 80 and 90 gets a silver, everything that gets 70 to 80 is a bronze, and we're not making any value judgments. It's a number, right? That's a perfectly legitimate way to do it. I spent the better part of 5 years looking at how to create a rating system when I first launched chocophile.com in 2001. And I'm sitting, this is like the Usenet, right? And communicating with people, and rec.chocolate, alt.rec.chocolate, and things like that. And this is where I met Alex Rast, or corresponded with Alex Rast, who was one of the people involved in the International Chocolate Awards for the first time, right? And we started talking about rating systems and what they meant. And psychologically, mechanically, there's no difference between an 87 and an 89, but 2 points. And so 2 points between 89 and 91, but psychologically, there's a lot of difference between 89 and 91. And that's not something, it's really, really hard. But I think that if what you do is you move away from, me as a chocolate critic, I'm the expert, you should like what I tell you is good, right? And that if you don't like it, there's something wrong with you. And I think this is something that's happened with the internet, right? If there's a 5-star rating of this restaurant and everybody's going, oh, here's the most viral thing at the moment, and everybody's loving it. If you go to the restaurant and you don't like it, you go, what's wrong with me? Right? Why am I taking responsibility for it? Right? It's not. Listen, the chef could have had an off night, right? Maybe the chef was out and it's the chef de cuisine who's in, right? And maybe I just don't like it, right? And we've given up the ability to say that to some extent, right? The wisdom of the crowd is the tyranny of the crowd, and I think it's been especially a challenge since, Paul Giamatti's character took Thomas Hayden Church's character out into the alley, behind the bar, and said, if anybody orders Merlot, I'm leaving. And Merlot sales tanked, right? How many people are out there saying, I like white chocolate, right? Fewer than say, I like white Zinfandel, right? Because people say, if we like white chocolate, you can't love chocolate, right? And no, it's like, I like what I like, right? So you can like nothing but Pilsners and lagers, and you don't like high IBU IPAs. Nobody's going to tell you your taste is wrong because you don't like IPAs. Nobody's going to tell you you don't love beer because you don't like Rodenbach Grand Cru or some, really, really big sour. Nobody's going to tell you that. You like what you like. And the whole point of all this beer judging and education is to help you find what makes you happy, right? And that's where we need to get to in chocolate judging and chocolate education, I think, rather than, oh, I'm tasting matsutake mushrooms in here. That makes no sense to me.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about pairing beer and chocolate. This is something I do a lot professionally. You have done this some as well. But as we've talked about in our private conversations, we come at this from a little bit different angle because your background is primarily chocolate. And I was in craft beer before I got interested in craft chocolate. So I'm curious to hear from you a little bit. If somebody comes to you and says, Clay, we want you to put together a beer and chocolate pairing, what is your mindset as you're approaching that in terms of how you're going to plan those pairings? Are you thinking, I've got these 3 bars that I love, I've got to find beers for those? Or what is your mindset of how you're going to go about that?
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, getting a Cicerone certification is an amazing way to raise your beer knowledge and can be a game changer for your beer career. But how are you supposed to find the time to prep, and how are you supposed to know exactly what to study? Don't sweat, because the Beer Scholar has you covered. The Beer Scholar is a sponsor of Bean to Barstool, but I can tell you from personal experience years before I was doing this podcast how helpful the Beer Scholar study guides are. They offer efficient online courses for levels 1 and 2 that cover everything you need to know, tips and tricks for how to pass the exams, and include live weekly Zooms to taste and discuss classic beer styles together. They even have a new coaching program for the Level 3 Advanced Cicerone exam. I used the Beer Scholar study guide to pass my Level 2 exam many years ago. I wish the Level 3 had been around when I took that exam. I had to do it on my own. Wish their study guides had been available for that at the time. The vast majority of certified Cicerones in the world today have used Beer Scholar to help achieve the goal of passing that exam. If you are ready to take your beer career to the next level, visit thebeerscholar.com and check out their online courses.
Well, one of the first things I do is I ask, listen, if you're getting, what is the reason for getting together, and why are we celebrating with chocolate and beer?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what is the goal for the evening? Right? It might be just, it's a social gathering. I'm trying to recognize employees. I'm doing a product launch and I want to talk about some specific aspect of my business to new customers. Right? And so the first thing I do is like, why are we getting together? What is the goal? Right? The other thing that I learned, I learned this doing a chocolate and wine pairing at the Torch Club, which is the faculty club at New York University. It was done with the School of Continuing and Professional Studies at NYU in conjunction with the James Beard Foundation. Is no matter what you do, 50% of the people in the room are going to hate it, right? And lean into that, right? And so my preferred method to do it is pick the beers or pick the chocolates, and then let's go. I worry about things that I know will really, really clash badly. So, for example, I know if somebody comes with a high IBU IPA, right, I need to be careful about the chocolate that I pair with it, because almost everything is going to fail. So I might do something that's got a pine essence in it, or something that's got a resinous quantity. So if I'm doing a high IBU PA, does Pump Street make, a caraway seed bread chocolate? I mean, that would make sense. And,
Sure.
So I think about that way. One of the things I learned in working at the World Pastry Forum and the World Pastry Team Championships is the way pastry chefs think about this. So what they do is they complement and favor and contrast and texture. And so I think about textural components, right? And so if I've got like a room temperature British pale, I know that it's going to be yeasty and bready. And when I start, playing with the bubbles, it's going to have really, really big, soft bubbles that are going to expand in the mouth. And so I'm going to want a chocolate that's there. And I'm thinking yeasty and bready. What does that go with? And, but I mean, what's really interesting for me, and this is where I go, is number one is I prefer not to have tasted everything before I walk in. So when I was at the Southwest Chocolate and Coffee Festival in Albuquerque, I had tasted none of the beers. Right? No, we had wines. I had tasted none of the wines before I showed up, right? And that I'd only tasted 2 or 3 of the chocolates. Right? And my goal in doing this is to teach them my process. If I were doing a tasting, this is how I would go about doing it. And then if 2 people are sitting across the table from each other and one really loves something and one really doesn't like it, right? That's where the interesting conversation starts to happen. Sure. And this is where the education happens. You're tasting exactly the same thing, but maybe it's because, you grew up in an Asian household and you grew up in a Southern US household, and you just, there are flavors there that, just blowing your mind, right? Or something, there's something there. And as I say, that's where it gets interesting, because it's not about me. I could love the pairing. I could hate the pairing, but if I don't love it, I don't have to eat it. Right. So it's really all about getting to, what is it about this pairing that you found enjoyable? Right. And would you want it again? Right. And why? And I think that's very, very different from the way a lot of pairings are structured. Right.
I know
Um,
the answer to this is going to, of course,
okay.
depend upon, what the person organizing the event has asked you for, and like you
Yeah.
said, what is the event? But if we can simplify this at all, do you find when you're trying to put together pairings of chocolate with whatever beverage, wine, spirits, beer, do you find yourself maybe subconsciously working in service of one more than the other? Are you trying, it's like, I really want to make sure that this chocolate shines, or are you working toward the beverage? Do you find in yourself that you're working in one direction more than the other?
So if I was doing this on behalf of a chocolate maker, the answer is absolutely yes. What I would try to do is I would try to make sure that there were no awful pairings.
Mm-hmm.
So, but here's the point: failures are more instructive than successes, right? Which is really, and so embracing failure, I think, is really, really important to do. I also think that the conventional wisdom will only take you so far. Like big, big dark chocolates with big red wines, you run the risk of tannins
Mm-hmm.
clashing with each other. And so doing a white wine with a dark chocolate, I mean, is often just revelatory to people. I mean, my favorite pairing beer is Rodenbach Grand Cru, right? Because of it's so interesting in terms of the chemistry of the lambic and the Brettanomyces, the yeast that is used, so that you get really, really different results, right? With when you taste chocolates. And I actually have a pairing exercise which leans into that. It's called 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. So it's 4 beers and 4 chocolates, or 4 wines and 4 chocolates. And then you taste 3 wines or 3 beers with 1 chocolate, and then 3 chocolates with 1 beer, right? And then you want to say, ooh, how does this chocolate taste differently with different styles of beers? And you
Mm-hmm.
might go to a lager, you might go to a sour, you might go to a stout, whatever it is, doesn't really matter. And then the same thing, right? On the other side,
Yeah.
how does the chocolate influence the flavor of the beer? Right. And again, for me, that's more instructive than saying, here's a beer, here's a chocolate, yum, or
Yeah.
not. And so again, it's you're right. It's all about business intent. But if I'm doing this on behalf of a brewery, if I'm doing this on behalf of a winery, if I'm doing this on top of a chocolate maker, I'm focused on making sure that their product shines.
Yeah.
Right? But for me, it's sometimes it's less interesting because
Yeah.
I want to have
Yeah,
that
sometimes those
controversy in the room.
failures are the
Yeah,
most
yeah.
instructive part. When I'm leading a pairing, a public facing pairing where, anybody could be showing up to this and, buying tickets, I want several safe and really good pairings that I know these are going to have a broad appeal. They're going to show that the concept works. And then I want a couple that I will introduce and explain this is going to be divisive. Some of you are going to really like it, and some of you are not. And that's fine. I just want you to approach it with curiosity. It can be fun to taste something that tastes bad if you are approaching it with curiosity. So I will have a few in there that are kind of those curveballs or more, divisive ones. And I just want people to come to it with an open mind. You can decide at the end you didn't like it, but I want you to have it been glad that you tasted it.
you know, I, you know, I've been in so many different situations, right? And some of which I've had a lot of control over, and some of which I've had no control over. And so I have leaned into being comfortable when I have no control, right? Uh, and I will often, if I do have the luxury of tasting things in advance, I might be have it might be 30 minutes before the event starts, or when I walk in for setup, that'll be the first time I've had a chance to taste anything. And I really do suggest that people taste combinations that I don't present to them. Hold back some beer, hold back some chocolate. If you think that these two things are go together, I want you to try them and tell me if you think this is a better combination than the one I presented. I mean, I am just really encouraged when I run into a room and I find people experimenting this way and doing things that I wouldn't have thought of doing. Right? And that's the curiosity, I think, that I'm looking to rather. I have a lot more fun in those rooms than I do in the room where all they're doing is listening to me and doing what I tell them to do.
Sure.
That's not fun for me.
Yeah.
And I want it to be fun. It's chocolate and it's beer, right? It's
Yeah.
supposed to be fun, right?
And some of that is feeling out the audience. I think some people, especially there's less general cultural awareness of pairing beer with chocolate than there is chocolate with wine. We're right or wrong. I think that there's less, just acceptance of that. And so I think some people come to an event like this and they're giving it a try.
Right.
They don't know what they're
Right.
going to face. And so they kind of need, I feel like they sometimes kind of need me to prove the concept to them. You're going to taste things that taste good here. And I think for me, it depends on what the audience is.
Well, and you and I know this, right? Because we've done it for so long. So number one is that in my experience, pairing chocolate and beer is easier than pairing chocolate and wine.
Mm-hmm.
It's just easier, right? Number one is they share not only roasting flavors, but fermentation flavors, whereas wine only has fermentation flavors. So number one, right? So it's easier. And then there is this textural component, which you can get with chocolate and the bubble structure. I mean, and this is a thing that people may not think about, but go get yourself a glass of champagne and go get yourself a glass of prosecco, and what you'll do is you'll find that the bubble structure between those two are very, very different. Champagne has a tendency to be smaller bubbles, pinpoint, sharper, crisper, and prosecco has a tendency to be softer, right? And so I prefer to pair chocolate and prosecco with chocolate and champagne, right? Just because I can make that textural connection.
Yeah.
And once you get it, I think it makes an enormous amount of sense. And then milk chocolate. I mean, you've had Lindemann's Faro, which is the Belgian icing sugar, right? But it's got an apple-y component to it. I don't know if you're familiar, but that with a good milk chocolate, I mean, all of a sudden you have a caramel apple in your mouth.
Yeah.
Right. And it never would have occurred to me until I was doing a tasting in Chicago a bunch of years ago, and somebody showed up with Lindemann's Faro, which I had never had before. And all of a sudden it's like I'm at the last minute going, oh my gosh, of all the chocolates that I have here, what's going to be interesting? Right. And I'm tasting thing and I'm going, wow, a lambic, a sweet lambic, right? Right. Like the framboise and the other Lindemann's, right? And then milk chocolate, how does that work? And then, you think about Rodenbach Grand Cru, but then there is this Spanish chocolate maker, Cacao San Paca, that makes a matcha white chocolate with crystallized lemon in it. And then all of a sudden, this crystallized lemon with the sourness of the beer and the sweetness, and the earthiness of the matcha, it's just, that's that exploration and having fun is where I want to take people. And I much prefer to do that than having some sort of like straight corporate gig where, this red wine and this red wine and this red wine.
Well, that's what I love about both beer and chocolate so much. I have a ton of respect for wine and coffee and spirits, and I enjoy them. Part of what I love so much about beer and chocolate is that they have so many different dials to turn. You've got they are great foundations for flavor, and on beer you've got multiple foundational ingredients that can be tweaked, different levels, different options. Same on the chocolate with using it as a foundation for inclusions and things like that. Wine is fantastic, but it is just grapes. So you're always working with grapes to start out. You've always got some acidity. You've always got that different. So I just love the fact that you have so many different dials and levers that you can adjust on beer and chocolate to find those pairings so well.
Yeah. And again, if your goal as a presenter, right, ultimately is, for example, if I'm representing a chocolate and you can do a great chocolate and beer pairing, you've got a customer for that chocolate for a long time, because they're going to go, ooh, here's something you may never thought of before, and you're going to share it with friends, right? And the same thing is true. You're doing a beer, and all of a sudden there's a chocolate. The next time you have friends over, you're going to give them something they haven't done. So there's this idea. But whereas chocolate and wine pairings, to some extent, are they cliche? Maybe they're.
I think they're just familiar. They're just familiar.
That may be. That's probably a less loaded word to use to discuss. It's like, yeah, of course, chocolate and wine go together. But for example, I love. There's a Chateau Saint Michel, Washington State Vineyard, that does a Gewürztraminer, and people are going, chocolate and Gewürztraminer. How could you possibly do that? Right? Well, there's a little bit of residual sugar in it usually, but you can get some dry gewürzes. But this particular Chateau Saint Michel has a very, very subtle effervescence. Well, number one, which people are like, here's a gewürz. Wow, that doesn't taste like a gewürz. Number one, right? So you've got expectation subversion going on. when you're doing that. And then you're bringing out this interesting dark chocolate to go with it. And they're going, white wine and dark chocolate. No, that's not the way it's supposed to work. Right. It's that expectation subversion for me that's a lot of fun.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Pairing things that you would never go like. I love bringing white chocolate to a beer tasting.
Oh yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Clay, the last thing I'm going to ask you, and you can answer this however you want. What is one thing you think craft chocolate can learn from craft beer?
All right. So I'm going to set this up. So you and I are going to get together in the future, and we're going to continue this conversation in an episode of Pod Save Chocolate. And so I'm going to answer this question from my perspective, even though I think I'd rather ask you to answer it from your perspective. And but I'm going to get you to answer it from your perspective when we get back together in the future. And that is, I don't know that there is anything that craft beer can learn from craft chocolate, right? Other than to say that if you're a craft brewery, right, you need to have chocolate on your menu. You need to make it you need to think about your dessert menu, right, in terms of chocolate and incorporating chocolate in interesting ways. No, so for example, one of my favorite events ever was at Burp Castle, which is part of what they call the Brew Muta Triangle, right, in the east side of Manhattan. So Jimmy's number 43 and Sporting's and Burp Castle. It's just a Belgian beer bar, everything in casks. And I did a meeting, or I did a Valentine's Day tasting where if you walked in and you bought a beer, you could get a piece of chocolate to go with it, right? And I had an idea 72 hours in advance what kegs would be on tap, what casks would be on tap, but they could run out, and all of a sudden in the middle of the evening, right, there would be a changeover from one to the other, and I had to figure out what was going on, right, in doing it. And I think that if you're a craft beer bar and you don't have a chocolate pairing menu, right, I think you're missing a real opportunity to educate your guests. And if you're not doing fun nights like this, this was great. They just had me in. I sat at the corner of the bar. I got to taste all the beers. I would go to the store and I would bring half a dozen chocolates that I thought might be interesting based on what I knew was being served the night before.
Yeah.
Right. And have fun with it. And I think that's the thing that craft, if there's one thing that craft beer, right, could do, if you've got your own brew pub or something like that, is find a way to incorporate chocolate, because you will blow people's minds, right? Yeah. And it's a great way to develop that sort of brand loyalty or enhance the brand loyalty that you already have with your customers. That would be one thing.
And how about the other direction then? What could craft chocolate learn from the beer side?
I think that it is all around community at the home maker level, right? So, I mean, it's really interesting is that there's an enormous amount of development that has been done, not just in lessons in how to make beer, right, but in all the kit that is available to make beers, right? I'm going to make my own jockey box. And so how do I go make my own jockey box? It's like, what does that look like? So there's a lot of, in terms of the vessels that I can use and, the different colors of malt and all the different yeast, there's all that stuff that's going on. And there's this technology of different sizes. I can hand carbonate, I can hand can, I can do all these things. There's one machine to make chocolate. If I want to be a craft chocolate maker at home, it's like the Premier grinder. That's it, right? So I think that there is this really lack of interest that has been shown, right, to develop a home hobbyist chocolate maker community, right, that doesn't require $1,500 worth of investment, right? And so that's one of the things that I think that chocolate can learn from beer is if we have the home hobbyist who's as invested as the home brewer is, right, then a lot of these issues around education and appreciation and why it's okay to spend a lot, right, and why we should be cared about the lives and livelihoods of farmers, right? And things like that. I think that will come about as a result of that. I mean, the same thing is true of coffee. I mean, go look at James Hoffman on YouTube, and you can have an episode where there's a $30 grinder and a $3,000 grinder, right? And I, as the home hobbyist, get to decide how much I want to invest in my chocolate making or my coffee making. Where is it in the grinder? Is it the espresso machine? Is it in the beans? Do I start here and then move up? I'm going to do an AeroPress. I mean, there are so many options.
Yeah.
And, like a bicyclist, I get to decide how invested I am in my hobby and how much I want to invest in my hobby. None of that exists in chocolate. And I think that's something that, as an industry, we need to figure out how to solve.
Yeah,
and
really
that will move
point.
the needle significantly.
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially when looking at the beer side, there is such a home brewer to professional brewer pipeline that could really change the industry as well. All right, Clay. Well, I think we could probably keep doing this for another hour, but we've covered enough for now. We're going to do it in another hour on yours. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on today, and we'll talk on your side soon.
David, it's been a real pleasure to get to know you, and I look forward to future conversations and continuing conversations in Brussels in October. I think that's going to be fun as well.
I love Clay's thoughts on home brewing here, and I think he's right that the development of a grassroots home chocolate making culture would be game-changing for craft chocolate. Writing that a professional brewer started out as a home brewer is such a cliche by this point that it's kind of a joke among beer writers, and I refuse to include it in my articles unless there's some noteworthy aspect to that detail. It's assumed most craft brewers homebrewed first. If home chocolate making caught on in a bigger way, it could lead to an influx of talent and excitement in craft chocolate on the professional level, particularly since the financial barrier to entry to make small batch chocolate is significantly lower than for craft beer. Hear me, I'm not saying it's cheap or easy, but it is cheaper than starting a brewery. Clay mentioned several Belgian beers by name, so I want to explain a little bit more about those briefly if you want to seek them out. He mentioned Rodenbach Grand Cru as a favorite beer for pairing. That beer and the others brewed under the Rodenbach line are Flanders sour ales, sometimes specified as Flanders red ales to differentiate them from the closely related Oud Bruin style, though in their country of origin the line isn't always drawn. Flanders sour ales typically undergo a traditional ale yeast fermentation, then spend months or years in wooden vats where other microorganisms go to work on the beer, adding tartness and complexity. Famed late beer writer Michael Jackson, the man responsible for first describing many of the styles we recognize today, called these beers the Burgundies of Belgium for the way they evoked red wine. Clay also mentioned Westfalen and Sixtus. Those actually refer to the same brewery, a Trappist Abbey brewery that goes under the name Westfalen in Belgium at the St. Sixtus Abbey. They're primarily known for one beer, just called Westfalen 12, a rich 10.2% ABV Belgian quad. Don't go looking for it here in the U.S. Westfalen isn't available here, but if you get to Belgium, it's absolutely worth seeking out. For many years, it topped lists of the best beers in the world. If you can't make it to Belgium, pick up St. Bernardus Abbot 12, a widely available beer that may or may not be the exact same recipe. St. Bernardus contract brewed Westfalen's beers for decades before the latter launched their own brewery in the 1990s. St. Bernardus then created Abbot 12, and it's generally understood they continued to brew the same recipe they had been brewing for Westfalen. Finally, Clay mentioned Lindemann's Faro. Lindemann primarily brews beers in the Lambic family. Lambics are spontaneously fermented, barrel-aged, and blended sour ales brewed in and around Brussels. These beers are highly complex and often have very unexpected flavors and can be quite sour. Folks tend to either love them or hate them. Lindemann's reduces some of that challenging nature by sweetening their lambics and adding a range of fruits to them. These back-sweetened beers don't taste much like classic lambic or its aged version Goose, but can be tasty in the right moment. Their Faro, however, is a straight sweetened lambic with no fruit, a throwback to a very old tradition of adding sugar to lambic to temper the acidity. Faro is a great, wide-reaching beer for pairing with chocolate. Unfortunately, it's not widely distributed in the U.S., but you might be able to track it down. You can definitely get some of their sweetened fruit lambics if you want to give those a try. And they do a classic goose unsweetened called Cuvée Renee that is really excellent. You can read all about my pairing guidance for these and other beer styles in my Pairing Beer and Chocolate book. You can pick that up on beantobarstool.com. If you found this conversation with Clay Gordon interesting, I have good news. On Tuesday, July 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern, Clay and I will be continuing our discussion on his channel. Head to Clay's YouTube channel for Pod Save Chocolate, which I'll link to in the show notes, and listen as we further dissect today's topics and pick apart some new ones. If you can't catch it live or you're listening to this episode after July 9th, the episode will of course remain available for later viewing as well on Clay's YouTube channel. Thanks to Clay for coming on the show today and to all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.